Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Falk, and welcome to World Now, an almost monthly conversation produced by the World Affairs Council of Connecticut in partnership with, and I am so thrilled to mention this, we now have over 20 World Affairs Councils across the country who are supporting this program. And tonight, we're going to break a record. We had over 500 attendees pre-registered for tonight's conversation, showing that there is such interest, obviously, in the topic, but also our guest, Ambassador Michael McFaul, Stanford professor and author who served as U.S. ambassador to the Russian Federation for 2 years from 2012 to 2014. He's the author of several books, including the New York Times bestseller, From Cold War to Hot Peace, An American Ambassador in Putin's Russia. And I think I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that he's a very good friend of so many of us. He's visited really several World Affairs Councils, and I know he's on the schedule for many more. A quick reminder to all of you, help me with this. Often I see questions in the chat box, and I really cannot read those because unfortunately in the chat it scrolls. So please put your questions in the Q&A. And to those of you who sent your questions in advance, I'll try to get to as many of those as possible as well. We've included in the chat a link to Ambassador McFaul's bio, but let me just hit a few highlights. He's a native of Montana, and his association with Stanford University went all the way back because he received both his undergraduate and master's degrees at Stanford. He then headed to Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, where he earned his doctorate in international relations. And after tonight, I want to encourage all of you to do what I did this morning, and that is subscribe to his Substack column, McFaul's World. Ambassador McFaul, thanks so much for being with us tonight. And
Thanks
hopefully
for having me.
There you are. Good. Well, to start off, what led a young man from Montana to head to Stanford, and how quickly did you declare your major and pursue Russian studies, Soviet studies, I guess, at that time almost?
In Soviet studies back then. Yes, I'm that old, but thanks again for having me. Pleasure to be here, and I am speaking at lots of World Affairs Councils. Just was in the desert in Palm Springs a few days ago and coming to Dallas and Santa Fe, but I'm looking for other opportunities because I love speaking to your groups around the country. About me, I actually got interested in the Soviet Union when we moved from Butte, Montana to Bozeman, Montana, my junior year. And I was trying to find the easiest English class. And my new neighbor said, take debate, avoid Shakespeare, take the debate class. And I'm telling you this honestly, I wasn't interested in debate at the time, but I took the debate class, then joined the debate team. And the topic that year, my junior year of high school, was how to improve U.S. trade policy. We could have that one this year, by the way. It'd be a good one for high school debaters to wrestle with. And my partner and I ran a case, that's what they're called in policy debate, about increasing trade to the Soviet Union. And that's when I started to get interested in the Soviet Union, reading about it in high school on my debate team. By the way, my debate partner, his name was Steve Daines. He's Senator Steve Daines from the state of Montana, Republican. Obviously work for Barack Obama, but we still are friendly. And we agree on a lot of things, by the way, especially if the cameras are off. But that was what it was first, Jim. And so when I got to Stanford as a 17-year-old kid, my first trip to California, by the way, I enrolled in first year Russian and a survey course called How Nations Deal with Each Other, Intro to International Relations. And the combination of those two courses really had a big, giant impact on the trajectory of my future time at Stanford and my future life.
Very interesting. In the introduction for this book, you talked about how, one, it took a long time to write it. How did it evolve? And when you started the book, what was your intent?
Well, it took a long time to write. I think this is my most ambitious book ever, and I've written, I think, 9 books and edited another dozen, bigger than my dissertation. The first draft of this book, before people get afraid when they see how big it is now, was 1,200 pages long, 6,000 footnotes. And the original motivation was back in 2015. I spent a summer in Beijing. And back then, this will sound like ancient history. Back then, there was a thesis that modernization and economic development in China and Russia would lead to political change and democratization. And I saw how that failed in Russia. I knew that story. I've written about that. I wanted to see how it was playing out in China. And my initial assessment that is not playing out. It's not leading to democratization. That was the first motivation. Then President Trump, after he was elected, there was a new, much more confrontational approach towards China and Russia. The national security strategy was written. It sounds like he was in Dallas recently, H.R. McMaster. He was the author, the principal author of that document. I'm not so sure the president was that involved in it, by the way. I'm not sure he even agreed with it. But that document, as national security strategies go, was a very influential document. And it created a new debate here in the United States about, are we in a new Cold War with China and Russia? And so I then wanted to tackle that as the second piece of the book and interrogate that hypothesis. And I do so in the book. And my answer is, are we in a new Cold War? Yes. And then take a breath. Are we in a new Cold War? No. And both of those things are true. And we have to get that right if we're going to develop a smart US foreign policy for dealing with China and Russia. And that gets to the last motivation of the book. The last three chapters are all about what America should do, prescriptive chapters. I wrote all those before the last election. Um, but after President Trump was reelected, the urgency and the saliency of those chapters became even greater for me because on several major policy debates about America's place in the world, I disagree with the president. By the way, he's changed since my book has been published. He changes pretty rapidly. So some things he's a lot closer to me now, and some things are truly shocking to me that he's doing. We can talk about that later. But the main argument, I fundamentally believe, and I think I have that historical data to support the idea, the hypothesis, that the United States is better off being engaged in the world than not, that we're better off engaging with allies and within multilateral organizations than just going it alone. And our interests are best served if we support ideas of liberty, freedom, and democracy around the world and do that at home as well, versus just thinking these things don't matter and it's just about power. And that is fundamentally the essence of the end of the book. And I think that for me is probably the most important part of the book today.
As a reader, I'm glad you got it down under 1,000 pages. It's a very readable book. It's about what, 470 or so, and very well written, of course. One of the central arguments in the book is that you have suggested that perhaps we're not concerned enough about Russia and too concerned about China. Take a few minutes and explain why you feel so strongly about that and why the pundits, perhaps mostly inside the Beltway, are pushing a different view.
Yeah, well, it's a complicated question. That's why the book's 400 plus pages, and I want to keep emphasizing that. If you like bumper stickers and easy arguments, this is not your book. There are other people that make those arguments and keep with the argument for decades and decades, irrespective of how the data lines up. I had an open mind about that question when I started the research, but I would summarize it in the following way: when it comes to capabilities. Uh, there's no question that China is the more formidable superpower compared to Russia. Military power, economic power, reach around the world. They are the pacing threat, as the Biden administration used to call it, for the United States. That is true. Um, but what I think we get wrong when we just look at capabilities, we leave out intentions. We lead out how leaders might use those capabilities. And when I compare Russia and China in the book, Russia, on almost every metric except nuclear weapons, is behind China and behind the United States. But when it comes to using that power in dangerous, revisionist, and now I have to say imperial ways, given the barbaric invasion of Ukraine starting in 2022, or I should say the full-scale invasion in 2022, because the first invasion started in 2014, I see Putin as more threatening to international stability. Xi Jinping hasn't launched a full-scale invasion of a neighbor in Asia. Xi Jinping is not threatening innocent civilians in a foreign country every single night, slaughtering them with drones. Xi Jinping is not kidnapping tens of thousands of children from a neighboring country in the way that Putin is. And so, capabilities, that's one set of metrics, but these intentions, I think that Putin is a more dangerous leader. And I would even add to that um, one more thing I'm confident about, and one more thing I'm not confident about. I would even add to that that Putin has gotten more dangerous over the years, and more crazy, I would say, more ideological, less rational about advancing Russia's national interests. I don't think Russia's security or prosperity is served by this invasion in Ukraine. I just don't see it that way. And I have lots of Russian colleagues who agree with me, by the way. That's not an American statement. Putin has a different vision, but he has become more ideological over time. And that means he's become a bigger risk taker because he's not wedded to rational interest, calculations about rational interests. But on China, I want to emphasize a note of caution about my own assessment. I know Russia pretty well. I know the United States pretty well. I know the Cold War well. I've been teaching about China for 3 decades, and I go there often, but I'm not a China expert. I know all the literature. There's some fantastic scholars that we have here in the United States, in China, around the world, working on this problem of understanding Xi Jinping's intentions and motivations. And I want to be humble enough to admit that maybe this is a long game and a superpower, super long strategy, and I just haven't seen the full play of what they're trying to do. Some Americans say that China is an existential threat to the United States of America, that China wants to obliterate us, to remove us from the face of the earth. That's what existential means. When you hear politicians say that, that's what the word means. Uh, and maybe he has those secret intentions. I haven't been able to find data to support that hypothesis. But maybe when he's just with his communist buddies, that's what they're dreaming about. But I would even say, despite noting how much capability they have, second to none, only to us, they still don't have the capability to achieve those intentions. And I think if we assume that that's what they're trying to do and then devise foreign policies to try to contain a China that wants to take over the world, I think we're going to make mistakes. Not unlike we did during the Cold War, by the way, when we had a global containment strategy that we overreached with.
One of the points you make in the book is the different approach that both Russia and China are taking with the United Nations, and that China's goal, from your view, is not to truly disrupt the global world order. They want to be a greater part of it. And Russia is attempting to truly destroy, disrupt what we know is the international order that's been in place for the last 80 years. Can you expand on that? And as part of it, you talk about the drivers of conflict, and we don't have time to go in all three, but powers and regions and leaders. And it seems to me that Xi and Putin have very different perspectives on how they're driving their power.
That's a great observation. I think that's right. I try to expound on it, but you said it more eloquently, I think, than I do in my book. So thank you for that. But let me just a couple of threads to pull on there. So yes, we did set up a set of institutions after World War II. We and other countries wisely got together and say, we don't want to fight World War III again. That was a disaster for the world. Let's try an alternative. And that's how the United Nations was born. We then set up some economic institutions to unite the free world, the capitalist world. We kept the communists out back then, but that's the IMF, that's the World Bank, that's GATT, and then eventually the World Trade Organization, and to help us unite the free world along those lines. And that system worked very well. I think it worked fantastically well, helped us keep the peace and helped prosperity among our allies. We then made some mistakes. We probably let the Chinese in too fast into the World Trade Organization. I talk about that. We definitely violated the norms of the United Nations Security Council from time to time, and I talk about those instances, like the war in Iraq. But I still think those institutions served American power, and I'm nervous by their approach that President Trump has, where he just wants to withdraw from everything. He's not interested in the United Nations. He's not interested in multilateral organizations in general. I just think that's the wrong response, in part because of what you said earlier. The Chinese aren't leaving. They're not abandoning the United Nations. They are trying to leverage their influence within those old institutions that we created to advance their interests. And so if we leave, it doesn't mean the rest of the world is going to leave with us. And secondly, and in some ways I worry about this most of all with respect to US-China relations, Xi Jinping and leaders even before him started to construct their own clubs where China was the anchor of the club, not the United States of America. So Shanghai Cooperation Organization, BRICS, Belt and Road Initiative, AIIB, RCEP. That acronym, I'm sure most people don't even know what it means. It's a trading organization like the TPP that we decided to pull out of, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Well, they have their alternative where they're the leading country. And that worries me a lot because we're not creating anything new right now. We're just withdrawing. And I think that is not in America's long-term interest. Now, to Russia, I think Putin would be really happy to go back to like the 18th century and 19th century. No institutions, no rules, just spheres of influence, great powers getting together and carving up the world. I think that's his worldview. That's what he's nostalgic for. But I'm not nostalgic for that world. I think that world leads to a lot of chaos, a lot of conflict, and a lot of war.
You talked about how President Trump keeps on going from one position to another, and he certainly has changed in the last few weeks. Why do you think that is? And do you think that Zelensky can count on him now, or are we going to provide the assistance that you argued that we should have put in earlier?
So I don't know the answer to any of those great
Yeah.
questions. I want to be honest, but let me give my best guesses. Had we talked 8 months ago, I would have said that one of the consistencies in Trump's approach to foreign policy, he has many inconsistencies. He's all over the place all the time. But one of the consistencies during his first term and for the first months of his second term was his embrace of Putin. Putin's his friend. He can do no wrong. I don't think President Trump divides the world into autocrats and Democrats like I do. I think he thinks of the world as strong leaders and weak leaders, and he wants to be in the camp with strong leaders, irrespective if they're democratic or autocratic. And that's what he came in with. And then I want to applaud the president. I appreciate the fact that he said during the campaign and then kept good on the promise that he's going to try to use his presidential powers to end the war in Ukraine. Now, obviously, it didn't happen in a day like he promised, hasn't happened yet, but I applaud that he is engaged in that. And second, that you have to talk to the Russians to try to negotiate an end to this barbaric invasion of Ukraine. That's controversial, but I think the president's right to do that. Where I think his strategy has not worked is he thought that appeasing Putin, giving him everything he wanted, treating him with a lot of dignity, rolling out that red carpet as they did when Putin came to Alaska, that would somehow endear him to Putin, and then Putin would listen to Trump and say, okay, I guess you're right, I should stop fighting. In fact, I think it had the exact opposite effect. And remember, I've negotiated with Putin. I've been in the room with the guy for 5 years. I've been following him. We met in 1991. We go way back. I feel like I have a sense of the way he negotiates. And I think he saw all those carrots as just weakness. And he just kept asking for more rather than saying, okay, I'm going to stop the war. And in fact, from what I understand in talking to Americans and Ukrainians about the last set of asks is Putin even asked President Trump, and he put this before his special envoy, Stephen Witkoff, to ask Zelensky to remove his army from parts of the Donbass in eastern Ukraine that the Ukrainian army still holds. I mean, think about how crazy that is. That's because he thought he could just keep asking, keep asking. That's the bad news. The good news, although we have to wait and see if words match, if actions match words, the good news is I hear in the president's voice frustration now with Putin. Think that he understands that he's been taking him for a ride. And he has now said some critical things about Russia and Putin in a way he never has done that for a decade. That's very recent. He said some supportive things about President Zelensky, much better than that first meeting, which was a complete disaster when he berated Zelensky and embarrassed Zelensky. And by the way, embarrassed me as an American for how he treated Zelensky, his guest in his at the Oval Office of all places. But I'm cautiously encouraged by that. What I don't know is will the president actually lean in to actual actions that will match his more critical rhetoric. And for me, that's first and foremost new military assistance to the Ukrainians, not just selling weapons to our allies that we give to Ukraine. I'm glad we're doing that, but where we're also putting some skin in the game. And then that we also are going to provide direct military assistance to the Ukrainians in a way that could help them stop the advance of the Russian army that we see. It's very little, incremental, but it is happening on the battlefield. They need help to stop that advance.
One of the questions that we have is, do you think, and this is from Mark, how much of a burden is it to Ukraine that the United States is no longer donating funds or military equipment to help Ukraine with its war against Russia? Will this cause Ukraine to go bankrupt? But it is still providing some military equipment, isn't it? I mean, we've not cut it off.
Well, we're selling military equipment to our European allies now, and we're not providing economic assistance. And it's a great question. The economic part, by the way, doesn't get as much attention. It's as important to them to avoid bankruptcy. They got to be able to pay their troops, and they got to be able to pay their bills. And the Russian bombing is doing tremendous damage right now to the energy infrastructure of Ukraine. I worry that this is going to be the hardest winter of them all because of
Mhm.
that. So they need money to repair that. Um, and I just believe that it is part of being a good ally with our NATO allies to share the burdens of helping Ukraine. President Trump talks about burden sharing all the time. It's a phrase he loves. He wants our allies to spend more on their defense, and I agree with him on that. I'm 100% with President Trump on that. But that we have to share the burden too when it comes to Ukraine. We can't just assume that the Europeans are going to do it on their own. And I got to tell you, just at a kind of a moral level, I'm very uncomfortable with the current fact that American companies are now profiting from the war in Ukraine, and we're not helping the Ukrainians directly. I just think that's immoral. That's not the American way. That's not the way we led the free world during the Cold War. And so I
Mm.
hope that at some point we'll revisit that. And I would just remind everybody, if you look at opinion polls, most Americans agree with me. That is a very striking thing. And in fact, even in the last few months, even though President Trump has not talked at all about a new aid package to Ukraine, evidently, we have other countries. Argentina, we'll send them 40 billion, but we can't help the Ukrainians right now. But he's at odds with the American people on that. The polling is really clear on that. And so I hope there might be a renewed debate about a new aid package to Ukraine in the future.
What about the $150 million of assets that are still sitting largely in European banks? Isn't it time, Mark asks, for those to be released and give those proceeds to Ukraine?
100%. I actually coordinate international working group on Russian sanctions. We started just a few weeks after the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And it's a group of experts, Americans, Europeans, Ukrainians, and even a few Canadians from time to time, where we just we're writing papers that we send to all countries in the world about how to reduce Putin's income and how to reduce technology flowing into Russia that helps his war machine. And one of the first papers we published in October of 2022 was exactly what Mark just said we should do. And by the way, I think it's probably more than that, Mark. I think it's probably closer to 250 altogether, including, by the way, 5 or 10 billion here in the United States. And, we have experts and lawyers that did all the legal work on it to show that it is legal to do this. There are various ways, different formulas you could do it. Call it reparations if you wanted to. There's various terminology, but I just think the argument for it is crystal clear. And why wouldn't we give that money first before we ask European taxpayers and American taxpayers to provide money for reconstruction? I just think it's a very low-hanging fruit, and I hope finally it gets done sometime soon.
You wrote quite a bit in the book, and it's very important and interesting how you looked at it. But the cooperation between Russia and China, and particularly between the two leaders, can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so in the book, I do, as you can tell by the way we've been talking earlier, I do comparisons with the Cold War versus great power competition today, and I have a list of similarities and differences, right? I have both with respect to Russia and China. But one of the biggest differences is this close personal relationship between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, and therefore a close relationship between the government and country of Russia and China, because both of those countries are autocracies. So, what the leaders want actually drives policy. And this means that with respect to the war that Putin is conducting inside Ukraine, that he has, at least for until recently, a reliable purchaser of Russian energy exports in China, and he has a reliable source for technological components to either originate in China or to flow through China from third countries, including Western European countries, by the way, that are then used, those components are then used to build weapons that are then used to kill Ukrainians. And China is providing that to Russia. Now, having said all that, there is, I think, tension beneath the surface. And there's some evidence of that. So, for instance, there are these UN votes from time to time, not in the Security Council because those would get vetoed by Russia, but there are in the General Assembly resolutions of condemnation of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. China has abstained on all of them. China has never joined,
Mm.
I call them the rogue regimes, Nicaragua, Belarus, North Korea, Russia. They've never joined the 6 or 7 countries that voted against them. By the way, the last vote, the Trump administration voted with Russia, North Korea, Belarus, etc., Nicaragua. Just shocking to think about in this zigzag that Trump does, but China didn't. So that's a sign that I think Xi Jinping looks at his ally in Moscow and thinks, maybe he's just a little bit too crazy here. He's just reaching too far in. To go back to a theme we had before, I just don't think that Xi Jinping wants to tear it all down, this international system, whereas Putin, I think, is quite comfortable with that. And that creates some tension between the two leaders.
We've already talked some about President Trump, but Frankie Peralta says, do you think international relations with our allies will ever go back to the state they were prior to 2016? And I'd even go back to 1991 when you think about how President George H.W. Bush was able to build such a coalition of allies and partners.
Yeah, that's a hard question. And so everybody knows I start all of my contemporary chapters all around 1991, 92. And I go into detail in my slide deck. It's the first slide of my book talk where I talk about that glorious moment in 90, 91, 92, when the whole world seemed like they wanted to be democratic, the whole world seemed like they wanted capitalism, and most amazingly, George H.W. Bush did lead the entire world uh, in response to Saddam Hussein's annexation of Kuwait. And he said, this should not stand. It's right in the UN Charter. Annexation we do not allow. And just amazingly, he put together this fantastic coalition that included the Soviets, the Chinese, and everybody else. And we pushed Saddam Hussein out. And the liberal international order was working. That's probably its peak moment. Um, I don't think we'll get back to that. I would like us to, but I think that's unlikely. But I disagree with those that say, well, all that stuff is part of the past. We have to think about something new. I'm not ready to go there. I think unless you have something an alternative. Now, I talk at length in the book about reforms to that old international order, right? We're not going back to the status quo. We need to change things within NATO, within the World Trade Organization, within a multitudes of multilateral organizations. Same with economic assistance. Trump tore down USAID. We don't need to rebuild USAID the way it was before, but we do need to rebuild a revitalized 21st century organization for economic assistance if we're going to compete with the Chinese and the Russians. Um, uh, what I don't know analytically, I want to be honest, whether that opportunity will arise for us. You know, I travel a lot, and there are a lot of people that just think the old America's gone, and it's never coming back, and we got to figure out a way to figure out our security and issues on our own. You hear that a lot in Europe. You hear it in Asia. I was just in Asia a few months ago. Uh, I'm not, so that's on the analytic side, but on the normative side, I just think that, on the prescriptive side, I just think we're better off with allies than not. I think we're better off supporting ideas of democracy around the world than not. And therefore, I'm not ready to give up that what we did that helped us win the Cold War is so ancient and arcane that we can never go back to it. And that's a big message of the book.
One of the tools obviously we used to win the Cold War was public diplomacy.
Yes.
And you have an experience with the National Democratic Institute, and just about 3 weeks ago, the president of the NDI came to Dallas seeking
Oh,
funds.
oh,
And just today, I was checking just for our talk to see about Freedom. Went to the Freedom House site, which I had not done in a few weeks, and saw that they had lost about, well, have cut, terminated about 80% of their programs
yeah,
because they lost major USAID funding. So,
yes.
how does the United States stand now to promote democracy when we have basically withdrawn from every strong aspect that we had of public diplomacy? And is China filling the vacuum?
Yeah, I think this is just unilateral disarmament by the Trump administration, slashing those funds for groups like Freedom House and the National Democratic Institute, the International Republican Institute. So I want to be clear,
Mhm.
it's not a partisan thing. I all but those organizations. I worked for NDI back in Moscow in 1992, a long time ago, and most certainly, even going back earlier with the creation of the U.S. Agency for International Development, that was created by Kennedy, 1961. All of those institutions were, I think, important for helping inspire small d Democrats around the world. And I've met lots of these people over the course of my life. I've had the incredible privilege to meet people that were inspired by our system of government and wanted democracy compared to autocracy. By the way, most of the world still agrees with that. Most of the world would rather elect their leaders than have a colonel or a communist party or people speaking on behalf of God, allegedly, as they do in Iran. That the data is very clear on that. But the Trump administration just decided we're not going to do this anymore because I don't think the president cares about democracy abroad. And the vacuum will be filled by the Russians and the Chinese. They're not cutting their assistance programs. When it comes to independent, government subsidized media, he also is blowing that up. Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia. They're cutting funds to all those organizations. Chinese aren't cutting their funding to CGTN. Putin's not cutting his funding to Russia Today. And I just don't think we're going to be able to compete in this soft power world and this competition for hearts and minds without those kinds of institutions. And I just think it was reckless the way it was done. I was deeply disappointed that there was not a process that involved our Congress to interrogate some of the crazy things that Elon Musk and his Doge people were saying about these organizations. But the reason it was so easy to cut is because groups like USAID and the National Endowment for Democracy, they don't have ready-made constituents, around the country that will help to defend them. And that's another reason that I wanted to write this book, to go to all over the country to make the case for why these instruments of soft power influence were necessary for us to win the Cold War and will be instrumental again in this new era of great power competition.
Here's a very interesting question from David. Is there a way for the actual content of the phone calls between President Trump and Putin to be released to the appropriate Congressional National Security Oversight Committee so that President Trump can benefit so that benefit so that President Trump can benefit from their knowledge and expertise? I think a related question to that is, and it's somewhere on my screen, about President Trump using largely Russian interpreters. And could those notes also be subpoenaed in some form?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to pretend to be one here. To the best of my knowledge, these are called memcoms, memorandum of conversations, of communications, that are typically, there's a note taker in the room. I did this with President Obama when I worked at the White House. And then I write up my notes and circulate them to members of the executive branch, not to the congressional side. Maybe that should change, but I think right now there's no obligation for the executive branch to share those with Congress. But a more minimal thing, to your second question, would be to have note takers, so that the rest of the government knows what's going on. Mr. Witkoff has traveled to Russia. He has tremendous access to President Putin, but oftentimes he's in those meetings without any note takers. And as you suggested a couple of times, it sounds like he was using their translators. I don't know if that's true or not. I want to be careful there, but that's been alleged in the press. That just makes no sense. That's just crazy. And for a variety of reasons. Let me explain it. Number one, if there's not a memcom and nobody takes notes, then the rest of the government is flying blind. They have no idea what the president agreed with Vladimir Putin. It's really difficult to implement a foreign policy if you don't know what the president said in these meetings. Number two, with respect to translators, translators are not taking notes. They can't do that in simultaneous translation. That's not possible. But what they can do, and I interviewed our translators after every single meeting that I was a note taker, because I wanted to fill in the gaps and make sure I got the notes recorded as accurately as possible. Can't do that if you're using Kremlin translators. And then third, there's lots lost in translation. Even, I worked with the best translators at the State Department. Obviously, when the President of the United States is meeting with the President of Russia, you're getting the best translator that we have in the government. And yet, things can be lost in translation. things can be,
Sure.
different words can be done there. And if the translator's working for Putin, they might be spinning things in ways that are in their interests, not necessarily in America's interests.
Well, it is startling when you look at some of the video and you see Mr. Woodcoff walk into a room pretty much by himself and meeting across the table a large group of Russian professionals, including the president of Russia. What do you think now about Taiwan, which is such a flashpoint? You have been a strong advocate for deterrence and greater resources to Taiwan. Tell us more about why you feel that we're falling behind there and should do more.
So I worry, in terms of great power war, I worry about two places, Taiwan, and to a lesser extent, the South China Sea and Asia, and then, God forbid, some conflict over a NATO ally on the border of Russia or near Russia, right? Those are the two most dangerous places in the world right now for me. With respect to Taiwan, when I teach my course on American foreign policy here at Stanford, um, I like to emphasize really early on in the course what I call non-events. I don't think non-events get enough attention in studying history
Mm.
and studying how nations deal with each other. So lots of books have been written about wars. It's amazing to me. We still keep writing new books about wars that happened long ago. A lot of books about revolutions. I'm looking at my shelf here. I have, 50 or 60 of them on revolutions. By the way, you got some great books behind you. I see a lot of friends' books up
A lot
there.
of your friends,
Yes.
absolutely.
A lot of books about who won this election, not a lot of books about revolutions that didn't happen, wars that didn't happen, elections that almost were won. And I say that because one of the greatest achievements of Cold War diplomacy was the non-event of the non-war over the island of Taiwan. And Chinese leaders and American leaders and Taiwanese leaders and Japanese leaders should get a lot of credit for that. That just because it doesn't happen, right? We don't notice it, but the non-happening is the great achievement. And I just think I don't think there's a solution for the situation, the sovereignty disputes about Taiwan. Um, and let me digress here for a little bit. When I was in the government, I noticed this tendency of Americans. We're kind of like engineers, right? I noticed our diplomacy was a lot like engineering. We wanted to solve issues, solve problems, and we thought that
Yeah.
oftentimes we're the only ones that can do it. I have that spirit too, by the way. But I learned after 5 years in the government that sometimes you just have to manage some problems. You can't solve them, and that's the way I think about Taiwan. And therefore, I think there are two things we need to invest and double down on. One is deterrence, as you already mentioned, and so we want to make the invasion of the island of Taiwan as costly as we can. And the Taiwanese have to do a lot more on that front too. It's not just us, but
Mhm.
us, our Japanese allies, other allies in the region, and Taiwan, just make the costs as high as you can. But then, two, make crystal clear to Beijing that the United States is not going to recognize Taiwan as an independent country. Some American politicians go to the island and say, I want you to become free, and they invoke America and our war of independence.
Keep Nancy Pelosi at home.
Well, I just think that those kinds of declarations are not in the interest of stability. And I know that's a controversial thing to say. I go to Taiwan. I was just there a few months ago. But I think if we want to avoid a war which will be obviously a disaster for Taiwan, will be a big disaster for the PRC, the China, and will be a big disaster for us economically for sure. And God forbid if we're dragged into a war with China, then militarily as well, then smart people have to do all we can to avoid a war over Taiwan.
You don't hold back with a lot of interesting, I think, bold prescriptions about how to go forward. And one of them is PATO. Tell people about what that is.
That's my idea, and I know it's a radical idea, but for a multilateral military alliance in Asia, modeled after NATO. Um, And I write that because I'm worried about the balance of power shifting in Asia against the democracies. We've not been paying enough attention. We haven't been building as many ships as the Chinese have. Our operability with our allies, I think, is not as robust as it should be. And so to enhance the strength of the democratic world in Asia, I think bringing us into a multilateral organization could help us get there. There could lead to some synergies that we're not getting right now with this smoke and wheel set of systems that we have, where we have an alliance with China, excuse me, an alliance with Japan, alliance with South Korea, Australia, etc. Now, when I say this, I get a lot of pushback. I want you to know, and one of the pushbacks I get when I'm in Korea or Japan is, Mr. Professor, you're so naive about our history. You don't know about our horrible history between Korea and Japan. We can't be in an alliance with them. And I get it. I'm not an expert on that history, but I've studied that history. I understand it. But I've also studied the history of Europe. And I do know the history between Germany and France in two world wars, and the idea that because of that history, we could never have a multilateral alliance in Europe. We finally overcame that. I think we should at least take steps towards talking about it in Asia. And at a minimum, it could be something that we could trigger if China took the incredibly stupid mistake of invading Taiwan. They could know that this would be something that they would trigger, that would be a step that we would take immediately if they invaded Taiwan.
So it'd basically be like Article 5.
Yes, for the
Okay.
rest of the countries in the alliance.
We have a question from Nassim Khader from California. Where do you think democracies are most underperforming against autocracies right now?
Well, I'd have to put my country at the top of the list. I just never in my lifetime have the democratic institutions of the United States of America been so challenged. And when That's number one. And then two, when you add polarization to that, this acute polarization that we have in this country, that means we're just not getting basic things done. I don't know if the shutdown ended. I haven't been on the news today, but this is a crazy way to run a government. I just, this is not a move of strength. Um, and our adversaries see that. Um, Moreover, and I want to be clear, and I do go through all of the mistakes in the Cold War. I have a whole chapter in the book about mistakes during the Cold War. So please, don't think that I don't remember the mistake of Vietnam, the mistake of McCarthyism, the mistake of arming so-called freedom fighters in Angola. None of those things. The mistake of allying with apartheid South Africa. Those were mistakes and hypocritical things when it came to democracy. And we shouldn't repeat those mistakes today. But we did serve as an inspirational country to a lot of small D Democrats all over the world. And I know because I met them. I met some of them in communist Poland in 86 and 87 when I lived there. I met them living in the Soviet Union in 1988, 1990, 91. I met them in South Africa, people that still, despite the support for the apartheid regime from the government, were inspired that they wanted to be more like the United States of America. And we need that superpower of soft power attractiveness again if we're going to compete with Putin's Russia and Xi Jinping's China today.
Scott Mashburn from Dallas touches on what you just said. What will liberal democracy look like in the future? Who will lead and shape this idea? I mean, do you see anyone on the world stage that is really taking perhaps the mantle that we have put aside?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have a great answer. I would say generally social scientists are pretty bad at predicting the future. But I also worked 5 years in the government. I think the CIA is pretty bad at predicting the future too. We got a lot of things wrong when I was there. Uh, I, I just say a couple of things that give me hope. One, this we are in a democratic recession around the world. That is true. Freedom House scores show that pretty clearly. We are also in a recession with respect to our democratic performance here in the United States. We got a little bit of an uptick in 2024, but I predict with great certainty that when the data from 2025 come in, Freedom House scores there, that curve is going to go back down again, given the challenges that we're facing today in America. But I take hope from two things, maybe three things, but two first. One, we've had other democratic recessions before and recovered. So the 1930s was a pretty bad time for democracy in the world too, and lots of smart people, at fancy universities were saying it's a contest now between fascism and communism. Liberal democracy is fading. That turned out to be premature. Happened to get in the late 60s and early 70s when Marxism, Leninism was marching around the developing world. First Vietnam, all of Southeast Asia fell, Laos, Cambodia, then Angola, Mozambique, Nicaragua. And it just felt like the correlation of forces in history, as the Soviets were, that's a phrase from the Soviet propaganda, was on their side, and we were in retreat. And 15 years later, the Soviet Union collapsed and the whole world wanted to be democratic. So I'm not prepared to just concede that this moment is going to be permanent. Um, and moreover, if I go back hundreds of years in history, as I do in the end of my book, and we look at and we map autocracies versus democracies, there's way more democracies today than 300 years ago, and there was way fewer autocracies. Back then, everybody was a monarchy, right? We're much better off than then. But then the last thing I would say, and it's an interesting thing to chew on, if we're going to check out of this, are there other places that might lead? I see a lot of inspirational leaders, democratic leaders, small d democratic leaders. I want to keep emphasizing that. I'm not talking about the Democratic Party,
Mhm.
but I see some pretty inspirational leaders in Europe today, young leaders too, by the way, that because of what happened in Ukraine, that kind of woke up the whole continent, that they have to be more committed to this. And then with the election of President Trump, and a real anxiety about whether the United States is going to be there with them in the long haul. I see some new leaders emerging that do give me the hope that if God forbid, I still want us to be part of the team, right? In the battle between Democrats and autocrats, I want America to be on team democracy. I don't want us to leave. And I think we're better off, and Europe's better off, and small d Democrats all over the world are better off if we're engaged. But if we do withdraw, there are some very inspirational leaders in Europe, from big countries like the Chancellor of Germany today, but even smaller countries. The President of Finland, Alex Stubb, he's somebody I know well. By the way, he has a book coming out, not that's kind of similar to mine. I just read it recently. We should try to get him on this call when the book comes out. Watch him. He's from a small country, but he's got this figured out, I think, in a really smart way. And he gets the idea that they have to support President Zelensky. Uh, that's another guy,
You,
by the way. I put him on the
you,
list too. He's pretty
do you see
inspired.
anybody in the United States that inspires you in the same way? It seems to me one of the issues is that there are just no lines in the Senate anymore. I mean, the Congress has really abrogated its responsibility.
Yeah, that's a hard question. Um, I see individual politicians, and I don't want to name them because
Right.
I don't want to cause trouble for them. Sometimes associating with me is not necessarily in your political interests. But I'll tell you, there's a half a dozen people that are running for president that already have my book. That makes me feel good on the Democratic side, and I hope Republicans will read it too. They say Marco Rubio is running for president. I used to know Senator Rubio and his views. Uh, he used to think about these things in different ways. So, I see my mission, and then I see other political leaders. I see academics, Tim Snyder, great, moved to Toronto tragically and not here, but
Yeah.
he's still in this fight. I'm actually really glad to see my old boss, President Obama, back in the game, speaking out more about these things. I think he's very persuasive, and thinks along the lines, that I'm very sympathetic to. Um, but my real mission in writing this book is not the next electoral cycle. I think this is a debate that we're going to be having for years and decades to come. And I think somewhere along the way, foreign policy elites like myself just thought that we had all the answers, and we didn't need to talk to the American people about them. We got this. We know how the world works. And so, meetings in Washington or meetings in Palo Alto or Brussels, and we just stopped talking to the American people about these ideas. And that created a vacuum for illiberal ideas, for isolationist ideas, for ideas not based on democracy versus autocracy, but based on things that I do not think are in America's long-term national interest. So my mission is to look for those, young people that may be the future leaders. I was just in South Carolina, University of South Carolina, a couple weeks ago. I'd never been there before. Didn't know what to expect, by the way. I know how that state voted in the last election.
They let you
Uh,
in?
uh, well, I spoke and the event was completely sold out. 500 people came, and not everybody agreed with me. I had the opportunity to interact with people, but 3 days later, I got a photo from two students from the University of, their USC, not the USC we have here in California, and on Halloween they dressed up as Professor McFaul, and they had their ties and their names, and they had my book. And they wrote to me and said they were inspired. They never thought about the world in these terms. And maybe those are going to be the new lions of the 21st century. Maybe one of those will fill that role. And I definitely see that as part of my mission in writing this book and then talking to as many Americans as I can. And by the way, not just Americans. I just gave a talk to a group of Chinese visitors yesterday. Think about that. Think about the title of my book. I'm willing to talk to anybody about these ideas, because I
What
think it's
type of
going to be a long
questions did
game.
they, Mike, what type of questions did they ask you? What was their attitude towards what you said?
Well, their main focus was on Taiwan,
Yeah.
as you would have guessed. And I heard from them that they wanted to educate me about why reunification was important to their country after a century of humiliation. And this was just inevitable and it had to happen. And I pushed back on that and I reminded them that, Taiwan was not always part of mainland China. There's an indigenous population there. I know people that when the KMT came in 49, they were considered invaders. They weren't considered liberators. They had 50 years under Japanese occupation. And by the way, the Taiwanese look at that as a good time for their island, not a bad time. Very different way that they treated the island of Taiwan compared to the mainland. But the other thing I said, look, folks, lots of countries have had territories that were part of them and then gave them up. There's this thing called the British Empire. I don't know if you've studied it. This is what I was saying to them. And then some rebels said, we don't want to be part of the British Empire anymore.
Yeah.
And tragically, there was a war, but Britain was just fine without the United States of America, and they were just fine, getting rid of all those other pieces that used to be part of the British
That's
Empire.
true.
We too did some of that, even in American history. Um, but
We're almost out of time, but let me just ask you if you can go take one more questions, and this is from Joseph Scherer. Do you see cultural shifts inside Russia that might shift its policy? And that'll be our last question.
Big, great, important question. I would, with more time, I would say the same thing about China. But I'll end on this. I find it just so tragic what's happened in Putin's Russia. I was one of those young people that went to Russia in the 90s to build democracy, and it failed. and people made it fail. I don't think history did. I don't think culture did. I think it was individuals. But if that's true, then that makes me cautiously optimistic that new individuals sometime in the future could reverse what I think has been a very tragic chapter in Russian history.
Well, Ambassador Mike, thank you so much for being with us tonight. And thanks to all of our listeners. Our next program is going to be with Tom Standage. This is an annual program that we do at the World Affairs Council and on WorldNow. Tom Standage will be telling us about the world ahead 2026.